3:47 a.m., Long Beach, California. Terminal Island Container Yard. 18 federal vehicles moved in from 3 directions simultaneously. No sirens. Headlights cut across wet asphalt. A tactical team in full gear crossed the yard perimeter at a sprint, heading for a row of sealed 40-foot containers lined up against the southern fence. Inside those 9 containers, $61 million in restricted military-grade electronics, sonar transducers, encrypted VHF communications gear, inertial measurement modules pulled from U.S. Navy surface combatant supply chains and rerouted over 22 months toward a buyer in Tehran. This is what the end of a federal export controls investigation looks like at 3:47 in the morning. The operation that led to this moment began not with a wiretap, not with an informant, not with a tip from an allied intelligence service. It began with a spreadsheet. A single HSI export controls agent cross-referencing shipping manifests against a watch list on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2026. 1 weight discrepancy. 9 export declarations, a company called Pacific Ridge Marine Instruments that should not have existed in the database at all. By August 2026, 7 people were in custody. The Arms Export Control Act, Sanctions Evasion, Conspiracy to Defraud the United States, sealed indictment unsealed at the moment the tactical teams moved. The network had been running for nearly 2 years, and it almost ran for 2 more. Pacific Ridge Marine Instruments was incorporated in Long Beach in late 2019. On paper, a legitimate commercial marine electronics supplier. Radar systems for offshore fishing fleets. Echo sounders, bridge navigation equipment for small workboats operating in the Pacific and along the western coast of Latin America. The company had real contracts: Mexico, Chile, the Philippines, 6 years of export filings, all clean, all compliant.
Customs broker relationships that went back years. A warehouse on a light industrial street 6 blocks from the port. A founder with an engineering background and a LinkedIn profile showing 20 years in commercial maritime electronics.
Nothing about Pacific Ridge triggered automated flags. Nothing surfaced in routine compliance reviews. The company had been audited twice by the Bureau of Industry and Security and cleared both times. That was the strategy. Build a real business, run it cleanly for years, let the compliance record accumulate. Then, when the moment came, use that clean history as cover for something else entirely. The founder of Pacific Ridge is identified in the indictment as Damian Farrick, 54. A tactical engineer by training, he had spent 17 years working for legitimate defense subcontractors before starting Pacific Ridge. He knew the export control system from the inside. He knew exactly which part numbers triggered automatic ECCN flags and which ones sat close enough to the boundary that a careless reviewer might miss them. That knowledge became the architecture of the scheme. Beginning in October 2025, Pacific Ridge started placing orders with 3 U.S.-based distributors for components described on purchase orders as commercial-tier marine electronics, echo sounder transducers, wideband VHF transceivers rated for civilian maritime use, fiber optic gyroscopes marketed for vessel stabilization systems. Each individual part number appeared legitimate. Each order looked consistent with Pacific Ridge's existing commercial business, and each item, according to the specifications buried in the technical datasheets, performed at tolerances that crossed into controlled military-grade territory. The sonar transducers could resolve targets at depths and frequencies restricted under the Commerce Control List. The VHF gear incorporated encryption architectures that mirrored equipment specified for Allied naval surface combatants. The inertial measurement modules had shock ratings and operating temperature ranges that placed them squarely within munitions-adjacent classifications. Farrick knew this. He had selected each component specifically because it straddled the classification boundary. He had the datasheets. He had access to the ECCN schedules. He ordered commercial tier part numbers, knowing the actual hardware met military specifications. The parts came in through normal distribution channels over a 4-month period. They were logged into Pacific Ridge's inventory system under their civilian descriptions. They were never flagged at point of sale because each individual order, taken alone, looked routine. Then they disappeared from the inventory records. I spent time going through the case documents, and one detail kept surfacing: the way Farrick handled the internal paper trail. He did not falsify records, he removed them. Entire product categories vanished from Pacific Ridge's inventory logs as though the stock had been sold or returned. No corresponding sales records, no return authorizations, just absence. That absence, paradoxically, is part of what eventually drew attention. The distribution pipeline ran through a Shell freight forwarding company registered in Dubai. The entity, referred to in court documents as the UAE intermediary, had been incorporated 18 months before the scheme began. It had a registered address at a commercial mail facility, a bank account at a mid-tier Gulf financial institution, and a website offering logistics services for commercial cargo moving between Asia and the Middle East. It had no employees, no warehouse, no physical operations of any kind. Pacific Ridge invoiced the UAE intermediary for equipment described as commercial marine electronics destined for fishing fleet resupply in Southeast Asia. The intermediary, in turn, consolidated the shipments and contracted with a licensed freight forwarder in Torrance, California, to prepare export documentation for onward movement through Karachi. The Torrance forwarder is not accused of knowing the ultimate destination. 2 of the 7 defendants are licensed customs brokers connected to the Torrance operation, and the indictment describes them as having filed declarations they had reason to know were false. The distinction matters legally. It matters less to the people in Tehran who had been waiting for the hardware because the final destination was not Karachi. Karachi was a transit node. The containers were scheduled for transshipment to a buyer in Iran, routed through a logistics network that U.S. sanctions investigators had been tracking independently for different reasons since 2024. That connection, when it surfaced, is what turned a routine export controls referral into a multi-agency federal operation.
1A26.
The HSI special agent who flagged the initial anomaly is identified in court documents by title only. An export controls agent based at the Los Angeles field office, assigned to routine manifest review. Not a special task force, not an elevated intelligence operation, routine work. The agent was cross-referencing export declarations against the ECCN watch list when 9 filings caught her attention. Pacific Ridge Marine Instruments, Commercial Marine Electronics, 9 separate declarations filed over a 6-week window, all routed through the same Torrance freight forwarder, all listing the UAE intermediary as the foreign consignee. The part numbers were commercial tier. That was what the declaration said. But the agent pulled the technical data sheets behind the part numbers, a step that is not required in routine processing and that most reviewers skip under workload pressure. The weight and dimensions of the declared items matched military variant specifications, not their commercial equivalents. A commercial echo sounder transducer and a restricted naval-grade sonar transducer can carry the same civilian part number from the same manufacturer if the distinction lives in the internal configuration, not the model designation. Farrick had exploited exactly that gap. The agent flagged the 9 declarations and referred the file to the supervisory level. Within 48 hours, the referral had reached NCIS Long Beach and CBP. Within a week, a coordinated probe had opened. The investigation ran for 4 months. The tactical teams at Terminal Island in August 2026 were the product of that 4 months of work, but the 4 months were not straightforward. 3 weeks into the investigation, the surveillance team tracking Pacific Ridge's warehouse ran into the first significant obstacle. The warehouse showed almost no activity, no deliveries, no outbound shipments. The inventory that should have been there, based on purchase records subpoenaed from the distributors, was simply not visible. The assessment inside the investigation, either the goods had already moved, or the warehouse had a secondary access point the surveillance team had not located. Both possibilities were bad. If the shipment had already cleared, the investigation was chasing an empty trail. If there was a secondary access, weeks of surveillance footage was incomplete. The case agent made the decision to pull the surveillance back and run title searches on adjoining properties. 3 days later, they found a secondary lot connected to the Pacific Ridge warehouse through an interior access door that did not appear on the building's permitted plans. The goods were there. The timeline was intact. The operation had not moved. Not yet. Here's the thing most people don't think about with export control cases. The hardest part is not finding the contraband. The hardest part is proving intent. A company that accidentally misfiled an ECCN classification faces administrative penalties. A company that deliberately exploited a classification boundary to route military-grade hardware to a sanctioned state faces federal prison. The difference is documented intent. And documented intent requires evidence of what Farrick and his associates knew, when they knew it, and what they said to each other about it. That evidence came from a laptop, specifically from a laptop seized at the Terminal Island container yard on the morning of the raid. The device had been placed inside one of the 9 containers, wrapped in static shielding packaging, tucked behind a layer of legitimate commercial electronics that matched the declared contents. The laptop contained 22 months of routing correspondence, internal planning documents, wire transfer records, specific communications between Farrick, the Dubai-based sales agent identified in the indictment as Raul Nassab, and a contact described only as the Iranian buyer's procurement coordinator. Those communications describe, in operational detail, the classification strategy, which part numbers to use, how to sequence the orders to avoid triggering quantity thresholds, which freight forwarder had the loosest review process, what to do if a shipment was held for inspection. One message, sent in November 2025, reads, "The commercial designation is adequate if the review is surface level, it will not survive a technical review. Schedule accordingly." That message is now federal evidence. What strikes us about this case is the patience it required. Not from the investigators, though 4 months of controlled surveillance is not nothing. From Farek and his network, 6 years of legitimate business operations before the first restricted component moved, 18 months building the UAE intermediary before it processed a single invoice. The scheme was designed to be slow because speed is what triggers flags. The irony is that the patience itself created the paper trail that ended it. The Dubai-based sales agent, Nasab 41, is described in the indictment as the network's external commercial interface. He managed relationships with the UAE intermediary and coordinated with the Karachi transit logistics. 3 Iranian passports were recovered at the Terminal Island container yard, recovered from a document wallet found in the secondary access compartment of one of the containers. The passports are not directly tied to Nasab in public filings. Who was carrying them? That question is not answered in the public record. The controlled buy phase of the investigation began in May 2026. An undercover operative posing as an Iranian procurement intermediary made contact with Nasab through a channel that HSI had identified from communications intercepts. The operative expressed interest in additional components beyond what was already in the pipeline. Specifically, a second set of inertial measurement modules and a batch of encrypted communications equipment. Nasab negotiated. He was careful. He never mentioned Iran directly in the initial exchanges. He referred to the end user as a regional maritime customer with specific operational requirements. He described the equipment in civilian language throughout, but he also confirmed in writing that the components needed to meet specifications that significantly exceeded civilian maritime standards. He provided technical parameters. He referenced prior shipments by shipment reference number. He described a delivery timeline that corresponded exactly to the 9 containers already staged at Terminal Island. That correspondence went into the case file. The controlled buys ran for 11 weeks. The undercover operative met with Nasab twice in person, once in Dubai and once in a third country not named in public filings. The meetings were recorded. The transcripts are under seal, but their existence is referenced in the indictment as part of the evidentiary basis for the conspiracy count. If you had been the undercover agent in that Dubai meeting, sitting across from someone who had spent 2 years building a pipeline to route U.S. military-grade electronics to Iran, what would you have noticed? What would have given it away? The answer, according to investigators, is almost nothing. Nasab ran the conversation like a legitimate procurement discussion. He was knowledgeable, composed, and specific. He had done this before. The indictment suggests this was not the first network he had facilitated. What was recovered from the 9 containers at Terminal Island, cataloged by CBP agents over a 12-hour evidence processing operation, sonar transducers rated for military-adjacent acoustic frequencies, 47 units. The encrypted VHF transceivers configured for military frequency hopping protocols, 31 units. Inertial measurement modules with shock and temperature ratings exceeding civilian maritime specifications, 22 units. Commercial marine electronics matching the declared export manifests, present throughout, packed around the restricted components in a layered arrangement designed to present the commercial goods first to any physical inspection. Total declared value on the export filings, $4.2 million. Assessed restricted value by federal evaluators, $61 million. The cataloging process itself took 12 hours and required technical evaluators from both the Department of Commerce and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service working in parallel. Each restricted unit was photographed, serialized, and cross-referenced against the technical datasheets recovered from the seized laptop. In several instances, the physical hardware had been relabeled. Manufacturer identification plates replaced with civilian tier designations that matched the declared part numbers on the export filings. The relabeling was precise enough that a physical inspection without the underlying datasheets would have missed it. It had been done with the kind of care that comes from knowing exactly what an inspector looks for. 2 of the 47 sonar transducers showed evidence of prior use. They had not come directly from distributor stock. Their provenance is listed as under investigation in current court filings. In the weeks immediately after the raid, federal prosecutors requested that a second team of Navy technical specialists review the full component inventory against current Naval Surface Warfare Center specifications. That review, completed in late August 2026, confirmed that 15 of the inertial measurement modules were functionally equivalent to components currently installed in active U.S. surface combatants. Not similar. Equivalent. Same shock tolerances, same thermal operating ranges, same output precision specifications. That finding elevated the case from a significant export controls prosecution to something that drew attention at the interagency level. The conversation inside the government about how those specifications ended up accessible through commercial distribution channels is not part of the public record. The coordinated raids on the morning of August 6, 2026, ran simultaneously at 3 sites: the Terminal Island Container Yard, the Pacific Ridge Warehouse, the Torrance Freight Forwarding Office. At the warehouse, tactical teams found additional restricted components that had not yet moved into the shipping pipeline. A secondary inventory, maintained separately from the official stock records, documented in a ledger that was not part of Pacific Ridge's digital systems. Handwritten, coded by internal designation numbers that required cross-referencing with the seized laptop to decode. The warehouse itself told its own story once investigators were inside. The front section, visible from the loading dock, was stocked with exactly the kind of commercial marine electronics Pacific Ridge had always traded in. Echo sounders and manufacturer packaging, radar display units, navigation receivers. All of it legitimate, all of it properly documented. The restricted inventory began 11 rows back, behind a false shelving partition that swung outward on concealed hinges. Behind the partition, a climate-controlled storage area, temperature-regulated to within 2 degrees Celsius, with humidity controls running on a dedicated HVAC circuit that did not appear on the building's utility records. The restricted components had been stored with more care than the commercial goods out front. At the Torrance office, agents recovered document archives covering 18 months of the scheme's export filings. The customs brokers on site were detained without incident. Both are cooperating with federal prosecutors, according to court filings. Their cooperation is the primary source of information about the specific routing decisions made at the Torrance end of the operation. 7 arrests total. Farrak, in custody. Nasab, detained at an international transit point and transferred to U.S. jurisdiction. The 2 customs brokers. 2 additional individuals connected to the UAE intermediary's logistics operations, detained through coordination with foreign partners. 1 more, a financial intermediary connected to the wire transfer network that processed payments from the Iranian buyer. The financial intermediary's identity is partially redacted in public filings. Unpopular opinion. The 2 customs brokers are the most consequential defendants in this case, and they will likely receive the lightest treatment. They had professional obligations, regulatory training, and direct access to the documentation that should have stopped the shipments at the filing stage. The system placed them at the exact choke point where this operation was most vulnerable. That they either missed it or chose not to look too hard is a failure of professional duty that federal penalties for cooperation will not fully account for. That is a structural problem that this case did not solve. The charges in the sealed indictment, now public violations of the Arms Export Control Act, carrying potential sentences of up to 20 years per count. International Emergency Economic Powers Act violations for the sanctions evasion component. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. The conspiracy count alone carries up to 5 years, and it names all 7 defendants. Bail was denied for Farrak and Nasab. The remaining defendants have conditions pending trial. No trial date has been set. The network that Pacific Ridge supplied is not fully mapped. The 22 months of routing correspondence on the seized laptop covers the operational window. But Nasab's prior history, referenced obliquely in the indictment, suggests an earlier phase of activity predating Pacific Ridge's involvement. That phase has not been publicly addressed. The buyer in Tehran received no hardware from the 9 containers. Those containers are now federal evidence. The procurement coordinator referenced in the seized communications is not among the arrested defendants. There is no extradition mechanism for that individual. The demand for restricted U.S. electronics in the Iranian naval procurement system did not begin with Farrak. It will not end with his arrest. The 9 containers sit in a federal evidence facility. The laptop has been fully imaged. The wire transfer records are with Treasury analysts. One question the indictment does not answer: how many prior shipments cleared before this one was flagged? The investigation's 4-month window began in March 2026. Pacific Ridge started acquiring restricted components in October 2025. That is a 5-month gap. What moved in those 5 months is not addressed in any public filing. If you've followed Iran's sanctions enforcement cases over the past several years, drop a comment on what you think the odds are that a network this patient stops at one pipeline. We read the thread. Subscribe if you want the follow-on when the trial phase opens. The cooperation agreements from the Torrance brokers are going to produce testimony that reshapes parts of this story. The containers are sealed, the indictment is public, the procurement coordinator is not in custody, the pipeline is interrupted. The requirement that created it is not.